Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. I am your host, Blaine Bartlett. We're going to be looking at the question here that I have been fascinated by for literally almost my entire professional career, and that's the question of organizational design. And when we think about designing something, an old exercise I used to do, and I still do sometimes with clients that I'm working with, is I'll have them make paper airplanes. I'll just, okay, everybody grab a sheet of A4 paper or regular size paper and just make a paper airplane. So everybody knows how to make a paper airplane. I said, okay, now your target and your task is to fly that paper airplane and hit a target that's about, 5 meters away, 15, 20 feet, something like that. Now, when I say go, just unleash your airplane and see what happens. So almost never does anybody hit the target spot on. So the next question that I ask has to do with, from a leadership perspective, what's the most important role in ensuring that that airplane actually gets to the target? And most people, the majority, will say, well, it's the pilot and or the navigator, hands-on control, or the one that's setting direction. You unbundle all of this, and it comes down to the actual most important role ends up being the one of the designer. If the plane isn't designed to do the task that you're asking it to do, I don't care how good your pilot is or how good your navigator is, you're going to crash into that mountaintop. And that's all she wrote. So this question of organizational design, I think, has a lot of components to it and a lot of heft to it. And my guest today, Mark LaScola, is the founder and former CEO of probably the oldest, if not the oldest, standing boutique organizational design firm on the planet. They've worked with over 500 companies, trained over 5,000 leaders and executives in their methodology. And what sets them apart, and we're going to explore this a little bit here, from traditional consultancies is, and I cop to this as a consultant myself. I've not oftentimes, but I've been around people that have been accused of, they hire the consultant, the consultant comes in, takes your, you say, what time is it? The consultant takes your wrist and looks at your watch and tells you what time it is. That's not what Mark's firm is up to. On the Mark is the name of the company, and they are highly collaborative. And it's in that collaboration that the magic happens. So we're going to be, I think, having a fascinating conversation here. Mark, I want to welcome you to the show. It's good to have you here.
Blaine, thank you so much in that introduction. There's so much we have to talk about, so I'm completely excited about what's forthcoming.
Okay, great. Well, the idea of a design becomes a container, and in that container, we charge ourselves with executing on strategy, and then all that stuff kind of falls out. The soul of the business, and this is kind of where I want to, or at least initially organize the conversation here. Every organization has a soul. At least in its founding, it had a soul that was kind of the esprit that kind of was the kernel that caused it to come into life. Over time, that gets covered up, and that gets covered up with processes. It gets covered up with structure. It gets covered up with history. I mean, all kinds of stuff begins to coalesce around this kernel that was very invigorating at the beginning. And we oftentimes find ourselves starving the life out of the business as a consequence of that. So first question, and then we're just going to see where this takes us, is when you hear the term the soul of business, what does that bring up for you?
It brings up the importance of the formal part of the business as well as the informal part of the business. It's the water you swim in as part of a business. And for us, it's an essential part of the operating model, which is what organization design actually redesigns as the operating model, which includes things like the culture and the ways of working and how do you unleash that spirit and that intent and esprit de corps as you've talked about it. So when we think about, when you're talking about the airplane designer and how important that role is, the operating model, a well-designed operating model, unleashes all of that soul and that spirit of a business. And so it both focuses on the ways of working, the culture, as well as the technical parts of the business simultaneously, and it takes the whole into account. So for us, it's about the intersection of the customer experience with the employee experience, with all those experiences, and say, how do we unleash the potential of this business? And for us, that's key.
Yeah, unleashing the potential. Now, some of the clients you've worked with, and I'll just kind of name drop a little bit here: Nestle, Fitbit, Amex, Qualcomm, Dolby. I mean, and on 6 different continents. I mean, On the Mark has done a lot of work with some very interesting, large organizations that are incredibly complex. And I remember, early in my career, I did a lot of work with some consultants out of McKinsey, and McKinsey had the famous 7S model.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. How would you contrast what On the Mark does relative to what at the time was kind of state of the art with McKinsey with that 7S model?
I'm not a big believer in dissing colleagues, and I think there's lots of opportunity out there. But it's one thing to have a model, but it's a whole other thing to design and redesign an operating model. McKinsey does some things very well, and there's
Mhm.
some things that just shouldn't do. It's like every consulting firm.
Yep.
Just like On the Mark, there's some things we do very well, and there's just some things we shouldn't do. One of the things I want to talk about, Blaine, is you use the word complex. Yes, businesses are very complex, but complexity is a mathematical equation between four elements, which is your product and service mix, your customers, the demand cycle, and then the variation in that cycle. That's it. That's all complexity is.
Yeah.
Everything else is person-made complication. And so we make a big distinction of most businesses are way overcomplicated, are fragmented into small parts and pieces, and end up having to put themselves back together again in things like, everybody can say no, but nobody can make a decision. Who makes a decision? The left hand and the right hand aren't joined up. We have the same customer using 10 different parts of our services or product mix, and the customer's tired of getting, passed around on the phone. That's not complexity. That's just complication. And
Yeah.
the issue is compounded because leaders approach fixing a business in a fragmented parts and pieces kind of way. We're going to bring Six Sigma in over here, and we're going to lean out this process. We're going to do some downsizing over here, and we're going to do some taking out some spans and layers over here. Oh, we're going to fix our comp and benefit system over here, and nobody's looking at all the pieces and how they join up.
Yeah. I mean, in your background in family therapy and marriage counseling, I was kind of struck by that. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, where's the fit here? Well, it has to do with complex systems dynamics.
Well, it does. The people dynamics are fascinating.
Yeah.
And in organizations, until we become all robots, a business is just a complex set of interactions. And the key is that you have to be able to understand all of us love patterns, and those patterns get repeated in businesses. And it's up to us as On the Mark, when we intervene in a business in an operating model, we're just not redesigning the operating model, but we're actually changing the patterns and the ways that they interact, problem solve, behave on a day in, day out basis. And anything less than that, Blaine, is really just fragmented work.
Human beings operate. I mean, we conduct our business, we conduct our lives through pattern recognition. I mean, that's kind of how we learn to communicate, all of that kind of stuff. It's pattern
Absolutely.
recognition, which opens up, I think, a really interesting area for exploration. The problem with change isn't the change itself, it's the disruption to relationships that change causes.
Well, I would disagree with that.
Okay, let's play with that.
Yeah, let's talk about it. So one of my mentors in our industry, Marilyn Emery, would talk about that people aren't tired of change. They're tired of people telling them what to do and how to do it. And so, fundamental to On the Mark's solution implementation is that we are consultant supported, but client decides. And we take them all the way through that process. And so that people are making their own choices about how do I want to change and how am I going to change because I'm part of the solution. And based on the adage that people support what they help to create. And so if I'm authoring my own change, it's much simpler for me to change that way rather than somebody coming in and telling me what to do, which then only sets up more resistance and reluctance, which is why I think change management, as we know it, is really just wasted effort and a waste of resources.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more on that. The idea, I'm going to come back, this notion of disrupted relationships. I remember when I was doing a lot of work with Nokia, I spent about 12 years as an external consultant working with their leadership team.
Uh-huh.
And near the end of my tenure with them, and I believe this was I think it was about 2000 and 2003, 2004, something like that. They went through, I think, 3 major reorganizations in 1 year. I mean, the telecom industry was just going crazy, and it was.
Yes, we're involved with some Verizon in kind of integrations and acquisitions. But go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, change fatigue, is where I was going to go with this, and I remember asking one of the senior leaders at the time that I was working with, when you're talking about change fatigue, what are you really talking about? And what she said was, I don't know who. It's a matrixed organization, and says I don't know who to report to anymore. Yeah, and these relational dynamics. Now, relationship, the obvious one is certainly the interpersonal relationships I have with my colleagues, my boss, the people that report to me, all that sort of stuff. But there's also a relationship with systems, relationship with vision and values, relationship with, you name it. There's a relational dynamic that's in play.
Yeah.
And I remember something that Virginia Satir said or wrote about
Oh
years
my
ago.
God, I love that woman. I have
Oh,
all her books.
amazing. The way that she defines communication was that it was the ways, plural, the ways we work out common meaning with one another.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
that whole definitional structure, common meaning, because if I'm just throwing data out and say, well, here's the business reason we're changing, that doesn't generate any meaning for me at a personal level.
So one of the things I love is psycholinguistics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we talk a lot about when we're working with groups is people use words to express very complicated and complex experiences in their lives. And the experiences that you have, Blaine, are totally different than I have, but we may use a similar word. And we have completely different meanings behind those words. So in our work, when we're taking groups through redesign process, part of the problem solving and decision making and the design process is slowing it down enough so that they become curious about what do you mean by the term X or Y, and tell me what that looks like. And you'd be surprised how simple that is when people have the space and the time to really deeply listen and clarify for each other. It's profound.
Yeah. So this kind of, I think, speaks to the value of your modality, which is steeped in collaboration. It really is steeped in collaboration. And by collaboration, again, we're going to use words that are symbols for experiences, but the idea of collaboration is, for me, it's we wrestle with stuff until we can get to a common meaning that is generative for all concerned, that are all the stakeholders that are concerned. Is
That's
that a
right.
fair assessment about kind of how you go about doing stuff? Because it's a
Well,
wrestling match for a while.
this is the emergent. Well, it's a wrestling match if their patterns are one that they don't listen to each other and are curious about each other.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that all of our work does is it teaches people on how to problem solve differently than they've ever done before in their lives. And in fact, it's one of the lasting, if you will, behaviors that that sticks forever, which is, sometimes they call it the on the mark way, but it's teaching people on clarifying words and taking the time to basically work through and understand is really what allows them to unlock and get to places of common ground, and what have you. So it's every time I see it, even 35 years later, for me, it's what fuels my passion for this work is watching groups of people coming together and solving really complex and complicated problems where they've never had luck before doing that. You talked about Virginia Satir, and I do want to mention, what I think her people making book
Yeah, people
about
making.
one up, one down, and then communication and how do you teach. A lot of power gets communicated through how we communicate and what we communicate with each other, and again, subtle. But here's my marriage and family therapy background. I was trained in that systems work, and in fact, saw Virginia Satir at SL up in Big Sur,
Yeah, of Eslan.
Esalen, right? As well as some of her other colleagues, and I just think their work's fascinating, and it intersects beautifully with operating model work, and it's really what makes this stuff come alive.
Hi, I'd like to ask you to do something for me if you wouldn't mind. If you like this episode, I'd like you to not only subscribe on your favorite site, but I'd also like you to give a rating. Ideally, a 5-star rating would be greatly appreciated. But I think more importantly also would be just some comments. That helps with the algorithm and it helps build the audience with this. And more than anything else, if you could invite somebody else to listen, just share this episode with a friend, with a colleague. And I'd like to see how we can grow the soul of business. I think it makes a difference. Thanks. You mentioned problem solving, and I stumbled into this years and years and years ago, but it struck me as I was working with some of the clients I was working with that their approach to problem solving, and this is a kind of a default, I think, for most organizations, most people, both professionally and personally, is we look to the past for success stories. Okay, what worked before? This looks like something that I've seen before. Let me take this bag of experiences I've got, throw stuff up here, and look at which one's likely to solve this problem. The difficulty with that I came to really appreciate is I continue if I'm pulling past solutions to fix a current problem. Yeah, the problem may be ameliorated, but what I've literally done is I've reintroduced into the system the elements that caused the problem in the first place.
That's right. You carry forward unspoken assumptions about that, and you, in some ways, like a box, you box yourself in.
Yeah. So part of this was kind of a reframe for some of the folks I was working with. Rather than being problem solvers, set yourself up as a problem causer.
Right.
And what I meant by that was find a solution that's going to generate a different kind of a problem, one that's more in alignment with where you say you'd like to be.
One of the things that we do in our work, we call it roll the marble. We take real scenarios and we run it through solutions, concept solutions, and we keep breaking it and keep working it until they've come up with a solution that's robust enough to handle whatever the marble is, come down the road, if you will. And it's a wonderful way to take ideas, test them, try them, and go, that won't work, and here's why. As long as and remember, in operating model work, it's all got to fit to what we're trying to do as a company or as to an organization. So you've got requirements and you got parameters and constraints that you have to work around and achieve while you're doing this ideation, while you're trying things out in very practical terms. How would this work? There's been so many. We just had a customer call us who used to be work with a company called CSL Behring, a pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, I know them well.
Out of Philadelphia and Melbourne, Australia. Incredible company. But she was saying to us about 7-8 years ago, she attended a 3-day problem solving workshop with us, what we call an accelerated environment in Texas. And she said it was the most productive 3 days she's ever been part of as a leader. And it's really true when you get a diverse group of people together who all see a part of the problem, and you set up the right container or the right space for them to do the work they need to do with the support of leaders. It comes back to Margaret Mead. People can move mountains, and I believe deeply about that. And I've seen it happen over and over throughout my career.
Yeah, I'm loving this conversation. I'm just going to cop to that right now. We can. There's so
I
many
am too, by the way. I am too.
Yeah, I think I'm. When we were on together at office hours on that show, I mentioned that I'd done a fair amount, actually about 15 years of work with IDEO. The design and the notion of rapid iteration. Yeah, which is a major part of how they do their design work. In a practical sense, how does on the mark, if it does, I'm making an assumption here, but is rapid iteration, prototyping, is it part of something that you do here from an organizational design component or a concept?
Without a doubt, Blaine. So we have an 8-phase process that is part of our intellectual property, but it starts with, we separate at the beginning. We just want to map the current operating model and really understand what do we, avoid throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So what is it today? And the important part of doing that current state review, Blaine, is creating a movement of people that says, I'm not satisfied with where we're at today. So that it's not just the leader saying we're broken, we have to fix it. But we move to a phase then of requirement establishment. And then after we establish the requirements for the new operating model is where we do rapid prototyping. And we prototype concept designs to fit and to meet the criteria established in the requirements phase. And we prototype that and test it without roles or jobs. And we do that over and over again until they get to a place that says, we think we've got the concept design. And then that concept design is reviewed and approved by all the stakeholders or anyone who has a say in it. But that's where we do that prototyping and that ideation. Now, it repeats itself in detailed design, but it's much more granular, right? Because each phase of work sets up a set of decisions that you can't go back on. And so you have to work within those parameters of the previous decisions.
So, you're just kind of taking this thing and chunking it down.
We're chunking it down. That's absolutely correct. Where in the detailed design phase, we're doing roles and jobs and governance and management mechanisms into levels of detail. The last thing we do, Blaine, around people is management jobs. It's not the first, unlike the large consulting houses.
Yeah.
The last thing we do is management jobs, because what we do is we work from the value creating process and what creates value in the organization, and we work from there on out. We don't start with people. We don't care about managers. And lovingly, we really don't care about people. What we want to know is what creates value what does your customers want and what creates value for them. And even with, hundreds of people in the room who are employees, they start saying, look, we don't care if Dan does this or Jose does that or Kathy does that. What we want to know is what creates real value. And when you're at the core of the business and you're deconstructing and then reconstructing from that place, it gives you entire freedom to come up with designs and operating models that you'd have never thought of in the beginning.
I love it. That's how the spirit keeps percolating.
Absolutely, it feeds, it snowballs, and the key there is to keep adding more people into the mix, but not losing who you had in there, because you can't lose the memory, you can't lose what we were thinking beforehand. So the key is what we call accelerated change readiness. Is how do you achieve readiness before you're ready to implement? And readiness is the psychological state of, let's go, we're ready to run. And it's being pulled into the business. And it's not a leader saying pushing it on people. Exactly.
Yeah. And that's a big, energetic. It's a big distinction energetically. Nobody likes to be pushed.
Absolutely. We bring in, Eastern philosophy. We talk about chi, we talk about energy. what's easier to push or pull, right? And that's part of what you have to create, and it's what creates the stickiness as well, Blaine. It's we've been part of. I think we've had this conversation on office hours when you're on there. Where leaders have left for a variety of reasons in the middle of implementing, and the design and the operating model has continued on because it's not in one person; it's
Right.
in the entire organization. Massive,
Huge win.
and
Yeah.
it's what avoids, D. Hawk, the founder of Visa, used
Oh,
to
yeah,
talk
I know
about.
D Hawk very
Yes,
well.
right. So he used to talk about change exhaustion and change worry. The reason that happens is because change never ends, and they never stabilize the changes, and they just keep making cosmetic changes. For example, there's really no such thing as a matrix organization. There's
No.
matrix reporting, but matrix organizations is really just over glued and over fragmented organization, and they're trying to glue it back up together, which is actually only makes things worse, to be
Worse.
quite honest with you.
Yeah. Boy, we're running close on time here. That's unfortunate. I've got two questions that I want to, one hopefully is a fairly short answer here, but in terms of scenario planning, I mean, right now your organizational development work is, okay, what are we doing right now, and what's in the immediate 36-month future here? But how do you work with organizations to scenario plan for for the black swan events that might be on the
Yes,
horizon?
absolutely. And what we do is we do scenario planning um, with organization design responses, so operating model responses. And in fact, the first time we did it was with BA Systems and their air systems and their support business in the UK. And the leader, Nigel Whitehead, at the time said, "Look, we've got 4 or 5 different options that are coming at us. We don't know which contracts we're going to win. So let's take each scenario, play it out, and say, what are the context clues that will tell you you need to do this, this, and this when they start to happen?" And then each scenario had a different operating model response. And they used that as a playbook over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And it was really quite fun to watch. And so that's not an uncommon thing for us to do.
What I like about that approach is it gives, operationally and structurally different models to actually organize around so that people don't get attached to a certain way of doing things. And the focus is on viability and value rather
That's
than,
exactly right.
rather than status quo.
And the other piece of that is if you have enough people who are part of developing those scenarios and the response to those scenarios, you've already got to jump on when things start to happen because people recognize those and people go, yes, it's time for us to do X, Y, or Z, whatever that is. So it's you had 2 questions. So what was the second question?
You've got a new book that you're writing right now. I want to be sure that we get that thing positioned here. So can you talk a little bit about it? I know it's not published yet, but
No, that's all right. I'm working with my publisher and book coach. It's basically on modernizing the operating model. If you remember back in the early 90s, late 80s, Hammer did re-engineering the corporation, right?
yep.
Imagine that, and it was quite the book at the time. So this book is really about what every leader should know about operating models and,
Mhm.
and the trade-offs and the choices that they have to make and the importance of an operating model and what it does, because there's no such thing as business transformation in terms of technology transformation. The only thing that exists out there is operating model transformation, and everything else is just an enabler to it. And it's amazing how few leaders really understand what an operating model is and what it does, because it's really just, it activates strategy. If you
Yeah.
don't have a good operating model, as we started at the top of the show, you're not going to be able to activate efficiently, effectively, and engage the soul of the business. And so, anyway. I'm hoping it's out spring, early summer, if you will. But I'm
Okay.
excited about it, and I also wanted to mention, Blaine, that On the Mark was recently acquired by Turner and Townsend, the global program project management firm, and we're delighted to be a part of that. And
Yeah.
so our work carries on, and it's just we just now have a larger playing field.
That piece is very exciting because that's a great organization, and they are very fortunate to have you as a part of their operating model.
We're delighted to be a part.
Okay. Folks, we've been listening to Mark LaScola, former CEO and the founder of On the Mark, probably the most, I'm going to say successful, but one of the most interesting organizational design consultancies, boutique consultancies on the planet. When I first came across Mark and the company, I was just I lit up like a Christmas tree. So ooh, I've got to have a conversation here. So, Mark, I want to thank you for making the time to have the conversation.
Blaine, thank you for having me. It's a real joy, a heartfelt joy, and thank you very much. As you can tell, I could talk about this for hours, and I want to wish you, your family, and all your listeners a happy Thanksgiving. We're only a week or two away from that. So.
Yep. So that being said, this will probably come out right after Thanksgiving, so we'll be able to celebrate the transition into Christmas as well.
Perfect. Well, Merry Christmas to your listeners as well, and to you and your family.
Okay. Folks, thank you for listening. As always, my admonition to you is find ways in your life to be a center of distribution, not accumulation. You're going to find your life works a whole lot better when you're finding ways to make a difference and giving things away. Your heart, your soul, not necessarily your soul, but what your soul represents. Okay? And have a great rest of your week. Take care.